Hi there, and welcome to today's training. We're going to take about a half an hour to cover the state of Wyoming's anti-discrimination policy. This policy is applicable to all employees, officials, appointees, and elected officials of the executive and legislative branches of Wyoming state government. It details what types of conduct are prohibited, what the complaint procedure is if someone feels they have been discriminated against, what the rules are for investigating complaints, and the expectation that corrective action will take place if it is determined that someone has violated this policy. Let's start by looking at the first section, which provides an overall statement of the policy. The state of Wyoming strongly disapproves of and does not tolerate discrimination as defined in this policy. Any form of discrimination or harassment that violates applicable state law, including but not limited to discrimination or harassment related to an individual's race, religion, color, sex, national origin, age, or disability, is a violation of this policy and is grounds for discipline, up to and including dismissal. All reported or suspected occurrences of discrimination or harassment shall be promptly and thoroughly investigated. If discrimination or harassment has occurred in violation of this policy, appropriate corrective action shall be taken, including discipline of the offending employee. So that's the policy in a nutshell. To learn about the rest of the policy, we're going to pop into Veronica's office. Veronica is a senior manager who is meeting with a new supervisor today about the anti-discrimination policy. Let's listen in to hear her perspective on what this new supervisor needs to understand and remember about this policy.
Hi, Archie. Thanks for coming in. I'm really excited to have you on board as a supervisor.
Thanks. I'm really happy to be on board.
I asked you to come in today so we could talk about the anti-discrimination policy, which is really important for supervisors to understand because supervisors are required to act on all potential violations of this policy, whether they witness the potentially inappropriate conduct firsthand or they are told about it by someone else. The state of Wyoming is committed to a workplace free of discrimination and harassment. I'd like to go over the policy with you and answer any questions you may have. Let's start by looking at the types of conduct that are prohibited. As you can see, sexual harassment is a big part of this policy. Sexual harassment means unwelcome sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, and other verbal or physical conduct of a sexual or gender-based nature. Some examples of inappropriate conduct may include demands for sexual favors in exchange for favorable or preferential treatment or quid pro quo, unwelcome and repeated flirtations, propositions, or advances, unwelcome physical touches, whistling, leering, improper gestures, sexual jokes, or sexually explicit, derogatory, or otherwise offensive language. Also, any displays of sexual explicit pictures or calendars could also be in violation of this policy.
I have a question. This quid pro quo thing, can you explain that? I haven't heard of it.
So an example of quid pro quo could be that a supervisor asks a female employee out on a date. The female employee says no, and it's not appropriate. And then the adverse action to that is that she gets demoted, or she doesn't get promoted because she did not go out on the date. Unfortunately, this may happen more than you might want to think. And if you've been paying attention to the news lately, this is more commonplace than we might think. So we really, as supervisors, need to be aware of what's going on in our workplace and look for body language or some red flags and make sure that people are being treated fairly and not being harassed.
So you said female. Does that mean that if a woman does the same thing to a man, that it's not sexual harassment?
No, that is sexual harassment. And I use gender type as it could be either or. Another example of sexual harassment that I have seen and would like to share with you today is that there was a group of men making sexual comments about women in the workplace. One particular man that was in the group did not like the comments and did not participate in the conversation. What happened to him was the other guys started to give him a hard time and calling him derogatory names based on his preferences. That is also considered sexual harassment. They were harassing their coworker. So it's important when these situations are brought to us that we need to go in and talk to everyone that's involved and ensure that this type of behavior stops.
So sexual harassment is when someone says or does something sexual. Is that what you mean?
Yes, that is considered sexual harassment if it offends the other person. However, you can see other types of sexual harassment in the workplace, like a calendar with women displayed on them, or a joke. If you overhear a joke that isn't sexual in nature, even if it wasn't intended for you to overhear, it could still be offensive, and that is a violation of the anti-discrimination policy, and it is considered harassment. When that should happen, Archie, I want you to know that I'm here to help you through this, and what we will do together is ensure that the behavior stops in the workplace, but then we need to make sure that is it severe and the frequency of it. So it is severe if somebody comes to us and says they feel like they are being harassed. But if it's the first time we've heard of that, that would determine what kind of action we would take.
So you're saying that any type of conduct that is sexual in nature or that could make someone uncomfortable on the basis of their gender could be sexual harassment?
That's right. And don't forget, it's not okay to use the state's internet, computers, or email to send anything of a sexual nature either. For instance, if you get an email from a friend of yours there's a picture that's inappropriate or even a joke, let me know right away and then delete it. If you receive an email or if one of your employees receive an email, that's one thing. But if you forward that email to a group of friends, that's when you can get in trouble. So if you receive something like that, Archie, I want you to let me know right away and then delete that.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
So let's look at other types of conduct that are prohibited by this policy. It's also inappropriate to base employment decisions or make jokes or derogatory comments on a basis of any protected class, such as ethnic background, age, religion, or disability. I have had an experience that I'd like to share with you on this type of prohibited conduct. We have a lot of employees that we're responsible for, and some of them work outside of the office. I had 2 employees. They were male, and they were in a work truck. Both are the same ethnic background. The truck had some issues, and so they went into a garage. The driver and the mechanic are good friends, and they are all 3 same ethnic background. They began joking around, calling each other names, and it offended the passenger that was with them. He came to me the next day and told me what had happened. And so, being a supervisor, I had to follow up with this. And as a supervisor, Archie, you will have to as well. And you'll have to go talk to them, explain to them that even though the conversation was not intended to offend him and it wasn't directed to him, it was still offensive and it is still a violation of this policy.
Okay, can I ask a question about another part of this section? It says here that any law that violates applicable anti-discrimination law is prohibited. Is there any other law that I need to know about?
That's a great question. We talked about disability, and so that could also fall under the Americans with Disability Act, which is the ADA. An example that I can give you, Archie, is that I had an employee who had worked for me for about 10 years. We had worked really well together. He came to me and explained his medical issues and the health problems he was going through, so he asked for an accommodation. I am not a medical doctor, and I don't think you are either. So the important thing to do here is if any employee comes to you and asks for an accommodation, you need to contact your human resource manager. They have the proper forms that they can send to the doctors, and that's exactly what they did. They sent the proper forms to his doctor, and the information came back from his medical provider that told us what a reasonable accommodation would be. Once that came in, I sat down with the employee and HR. We went over the recommended reasonable accommodations, and we were able to provide that to him. I have another example, though, that I want you to be aware of. I have another employee, and she has worked here for about 2 years. She's a great employee. She came to me and asked for an accommodation. She did not share with me what her medical condition was, though, and that's okay. So again, I went to HR and asked them to help me with filling out the forms and getting it to their doctor. Once the information came back in, I met with the HR people and the employee. I was never told the medical condition, but I was given the reasonable accommodations that the medical provider gave. We were able to provide that reasonable accommodation as well. The final item under prohibited conduct is important to understand as well. Retaliation is also prohibited. And as a rule of thumb, don't treat anybody differently because they filed a complaint or are part of a complaint process. Let me give you some examples. Not giving somebody a promotion is considered retaliation. Not including that person in a team meeting could be considered retaliation. An example that I had recently, I had a crew that was out on the road, and the one guy ended up having to do the flagging for the day. They had to make sure that the car stopped. They had to keep track of, the cones, and they were not allowed to take a break. That wasn't his normal job. His normal job was something else on the crew. But the supervisor of that crew was upset with him, and that's how he retaliated. Another thing that I think is the most important to know is giving the employee the silent treatment. You may feel that you're uncomfortable to talk to that person, or you just want to avoid it for a little bit, or maybe even give them a little bit of space. But by not talking to an employee and treating them the same way could be considered retaliation.
I'm glad you explained that. I might have thought that it was good to give someone space if they've made a complaint. So you really need to maintain the status quo.
Exactly. Don't treat anybody differently because they filed a complaint or are part of a complaint process.